Carl Schlechter is one of the greatest masters to have ever played the game of chess. In 1910, he came incredibly close to defeating Emanuel Lasker and taking his world champion title. With one game to go, he had a 1-point lead. He ultimately lost the game and drew the match. There is still debate today as to whether or not he needed to win the match by 2 points to take the title. That, in my opinion, would have been incredibly unfair conditions. Now, much like Anish Giri today, at the time he had an unfair reputation as being a drawing master. This game, though, has been called Schlechter's Immortal, and I hope it will put aside any question as to whether or not he was too solid. Schlechter's opponent Fleissig opens the game with pawn to b4. Now, today, this opening has been called the Orangutan, the Tartakover, and the Sokolowski. However, this is 1893. All of those names are decades in the future. I honestly have no idea what Fleissig would have called this opening move. For all I know, he might have called it Fleissig's super special opening move that no one ever anticipates. Schlechter, though, does respond well. He plays pawn to e6. Now, e5 is considered kind of the theoretical response, but it's b4. You can kind of do whatever you want and you'll be okay. So bishop to b2, knight to f6, pawn to a3, c5, a good move, striking at the b4 pawn, which does extend out kind of like a sore thumb. If we needed another name for the opening, I think sore thumb opening would not be a bad name for pawn to b4. Now, pawn to b5, capturing on c5 is probably a better move, but that's not why you played pawn to b4, to help your opponent develop their pieces. So pawn to d5 and d4. I don't like this move at all. I think that white's position is not very good to begin with, but this is not helping matters. At this point, Schlechter finds a very good continuation, but even if you don't want to think at all, you can just play pawn to c4 in this position and say, why have you done this to your bishop? And why are your pawns extended and vulnerable over on the queen side? Black is much, much better here without even thinking. Schlechter, though, did think and realized he could play queen to a5 check in this position, which is a great move. This is very awkward to meet, and this pawn on b5, the sore thumb, is extended and is loose. The only way to develop and hold on to that pawn is knight c3, which is played. But now the knight is pinned, which is not great, and so knight to e4, putting pressure on the pinned piece. Queen to d3 from Fleissig, who does develop the queen and defend the knight on c3. Pawn takes d4, and we have put more pressure on the pinned piece. Queen takes d4, you don't really have any choice, but queen takes d4 does walk into bishop c5, played by Schlechter. The bishop skewers the queen to the pawn on f2. Fortunately for Fleissig, he does have a square to move the queen that creates a counter threat. Queen takes g7, which does at least attack the rook here on h8. Now, at this point, the computer recommendation is the very simple move, rook to f8, saying, hey, I'm just going to move the rook that you're attacking, and look at all these pieces, and look at your king, and your position just sucks and is lost. And in this position, and in a few other positions, Schlechter could do this, could just, avoid Fleissig's threats and just basically have a winning position. But he doesn't do that, and I think we can all appreciate that he's going to continue to play throughout the game in the most aggressive style possible. So after queen takes g7, he goes bishop takes f2 check. King over to d1, and he could still play the safe rook to f8 in this position, but no, pawn to d4. A beautiful move, sacrificing one rook. Not the only rook we're going to sacrifice in this game, sacrificing that rook with check and creating huge pressure here on the knight on c3. And there's some big mating ideas. For example, first off, we should definitely capture the rook with check, right? So queen captures h8 with check and king up to e7. But back to the example I was going to give, if the knight moves from c3 where it is attacked by the pawn, then queen to e1, which is a pretty funny checkmate. And of course, black has just won the game because it's checkmate, and we all understand what that means. So backing up, after king e7, huge pressure here on the knight here. Black is going to gain some material on this side of the board over here. But meanwhile, Fleissig here can capture a loose bishop on c8, and he does. This does, however, turn out to be a mistake. And now the position is definitively losing by force. The computer recommendation is knight to h3, ignoring what's going on here over on c3 to create a counter threat against the bishop on f2 in some lines, which is really, a very computery move. I think to play knight to h3 is a lot to ask from Fleissig. Here, white cannot, or black cannot play pawn takes on c3, which might seem like the thing you want to do because bishop to c1. The bishop has one retreating square, and now there are too many threats for white, and the queen is actually cut off. She can't get to that beautiful mating square on e1. She doesn't have any way to get to the e file, which would also just end things. And amazingly, it's actually white who is winning in this position despite the terrible position of the king on d1. So, backing up. After knight h3, though, Schlechter can continue with knight takes e3 instead of pawn takes e3. Bishop takes e3, and queen takes c3, threatening checkmate. But then knight takes f2, queen takes on a1, and ultimately this position right here is super complicated, better for black, but not winning. So that was the best option available to Fleissig. He, though, plays queen takes c8, of course, very natural, capturing the undefended bishop, also threatening to capture this pawn on b7 and then capture the knight down here on e4 or capture the rook on a8. And it also helps, of course, that you're defending the knight on c3 in some lines. So queen takes c8 makes a lot of sense. But black is winning. Pawn takes on c3 here, of course, attacking this bishop. The bishop pulls back to the only safe square, bishop back to c1. And here, Schlechter had a pretty straightforward win, which is just queen takes b5. Not the most exciting move. He's going to play a more exciting move, but it's simple. It defends b7, and it simply threatens queen to d5, and this is just crushing here. There's no way to defend the attack on the d file. Very annoying for white is the fact that pawn to e3, trying to free the bishop, just allows queen takes f1, which is immediate checkmate. So after queen takes on b5, everything is covered, and meanwhile, white has no way to cover the idea of simply queen to d5. So this is -8 according to the engine for Schlechter. Schlechter, though, has already sacrificed a rook, so now it's time to sacrifice another rook. Knight to d7. And this leads to a beautiful finish, but the sacrifice of the rook here is not truly decisive if Fleissig defends accurately. Accurate defense was queen takes b7, which is honestly quite brilliant. With the chance here to capture a rook, capturing a pawn instead is striking. But now this is defended. We saw how strong queen takes b5 was a moment ago. The rook is still under attack, but more importantly, the knight on e4 is under attack. And the knight on e4 is a critical attacking piece for Schlechter. So the best move here is rook d8, attacking here along the d file. And this does win the queen, but does it win the game? After queen takes e4, a knight discovery on either c5 or on f6, there is queen d3. And you're going to have to capture the queen either now or very, very soon. And Schlechter's much better, but is he winning? That's not entirely clear at all. We could only say that black is better, but there's a lot of game left to play in this particular line. However, Fleissig is not the kind of guy who turns down a hanging rook. So he does play queen takes a8. And now Schlechter wins by force, and beautifully so. Queen takes b5. We've already talked about the idea of queen to d5 check here, which is just basically mate in 2 in this position. Bishop to f4, though, from Fleissig. So he develops the bishop and allows his king to run over to c1. So it looks like it's not so easy to finish things off for Schlechter. And it's not easy, but he does have the right ideas. He plays queen d5 check. The king must go over to c1. And this is a great moment to pause your video and figure out how Schlechter played the concluding combination that merited this game being called Schlechter's Immortal. Well, he plays bishop to e3 check. The point here, and there are other bishop moves that also work, is you need knight to f2, which is the next move that is coming. And so bishop e3 check is a brilliant clearance sacrifice to allow the knight to go to f2. Of course, king over to b1 allows the queen to come in, and this is leading to mate pretty straightforwardly, like in the game. So bishop takes e3 and knight to f2, a beautiful empty square sacrifice. The idea is queen to d1, checkmate in 1, king b1 not helping because queen d1, nope, sorry, not queen b1, I messed up. We have to go to b5 because we can't allow bishop c1. And then the queen comes in here and we have mate on the next move. Man, everything fits together really nicely, and it's still possible, as I just proved, to go wrong. So after knight f2, because of this idea of queen to d1, we have bishop takes f2, which does stop queen to d1, but now the bishop is no longer defending d2, so queen into d2 check, and Fleissig resigns here. The point is checkmate is forced after queen d2 check, king over to b1, queen d1 check, king to a2, and queen takes c2, checkmate. A beautiful final position, a beautiful game sacrificing both rooks by Schlechter. The game is not perfect. According to Fleissig, it was something like a blitz game. I don't know what blitz was back in 1893. I assume it's like 30 minutes per side as kind of blitz chess. So casual circumstances. Schlechter was definitely playing to a crowd that didn't really exist probably, but now exists on YouTube as we all get to enjoy this beautiful game. So I hope you enjoy this game. Definitely check out more of Schlechter's games if you're inspired by this. He was a really wonderful master, and if you want to see more of my favorite chess games from the before 1900s, then definitely click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen.